let's talk about happiness killers, because there's a couple out there. And this is a direct quote from Dr. Arthur Brooks. He said the most significant threat to relationships is the attempt to change another person to be like oneself. Woof. I don't know about you, but that hit me pretty hard, because I think that's a normal temptation, is wanting other people to act like us, think like us, believe like us, behave like us, and so on and so forth, because it seems like it would be so much better and so much easier if that was the case. But that is actually the most significant threat to relationships, let alone happy relationships. And that's why at the beginning of the episode, I said, I'm not going to be talking about anything which is dependent upon someone else, because in this, we're just focusing on what you and I can do and what's in our power. So happiness killer number 1 is attempting to change someone else. Happiness killer number 2 is assumptions. I'm so guilty of this. I truly am. I'm so guilty of it. I'm a chronic overthinker, and I just make up these stories as to what someone's doing or thinking, and it's nuts. And 95% of the time, they're not true. They're just made up in my head. And that's 100% a happiness killer, because it's not backed by data. It's just by fleeting feelings. And assumptions put a wedge between you and another person, which then brings me to number 3, and that's expectations. And expectations are believing that it's someone else's job, for instance, to make you happy. It's definitely not fair to have those expectations put upon somebody else, because nobody else can make you happy. As we're learning in this episode, we have the control and we have the ability to do it for ourselves. And the reason expectations are a happiness killer is because there's a lot of unmet expectations that you then have sitting inside of you, ready to just explode and burst out onto somebody else, because you didn't actually articulate what it is that you wanted or needed. And so unmet expectations and unsaid expectations are definitely happiness killer number 3. And it's a good rule of thumb to not have any expectations for anybody else, except for if you have articulated and asked for a certain thing. Then that's a different conversation. And I think fear is something that we often think about as the opposite of happiness, right? How can you be happy if you're afraid? That kind of overrides the brain as it's trying to protect us if we're actually living in fear. And so I kind of want to talk about strategies for overcoming fear and anxiety. And these are 2 that I have found helpful in my own life. Both of these strategies actually involve journaling. Now you might be like, I hate writing. I only type. Okay, only type. That's fine. There is science behind the power of writing something down and writing all the letters. I don't know. I'm just saying my recommendation would be to write it out, but you're definitely allowed to type. Okay, moving on. So to manage fear, you can write down your fears. That's the first step. Write it down. Now this is kind of backwards for people that are in the camp of don't write it down because you might manifest it. Well, science actually says otherwise in this department, and I'll explain how. First step is to write down your fear. Why? Because when you're writing it down, you're putting distance and a space and a gap between you and that fear. And it allows you to observe the fear kind of from a different perspective. And then there's 4 questions that you want to write down and think about the answers to after you've written down that fear. Number 1, what am I afraid of? Truly, write it down. 2, why is this happening? 3, what is the worst thing that can happen? And 4, what will I do if it happens? Now, by the time you get to 3 and 4, most of the time, I've found just how preposterous these fears were. That I was just creating crazy scenarios in which I was like, what will I do if it happened? Well, wait, the chances of that happening actually are so very low. And I'm just hinging it on the fact that that 5% chance is actually 100. And what will I do? Well, at the end of the day, I'm going to get through it. That's what I'm going to do. And so it's been a really interesting exercise to put that gap between the fear and then analyze it and try and come to a different conclusion about how I see it. So what's really interesting about this is that this process helps move the fear in your brain. It literally moves the fear in your brain from the amygdala. And I'm not a brain scientist, so don't ask me. But I think it's interesting that it shifts it, okay? It moves it from the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional reactions, to the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in decision making. So we just moved it from crazy town, emotional reactions, to logical thinking just by writing it down. Now, dang, that is a powerful exercise. That can change your day. That can change how you pursue happiness that day, when you write down the fear that might be holding you back from getting there. You know how I mentioned assumptions being a happiness killer? You can also do a twist on this journaling exercise with assumptions. I like to call it assumption journaling. And Dr. John Deloney, who's been a guest on the show, has talked about this before, because what you do in this is, once you have an assumption, now it takes a lot of work to get to this point, but it's worth it, of identifying, oh wait, this isn't true, this is just an assumption I'm making. Write the assumption down. And then think, wait, is this true? If you cannot objectively with data confirm that it is true, then you have to automatically rewrite it. Let me give you an example. This friend hates me. Wait, is that true? No, she just didn't respond to my message, but she might be busy right now. She doesn't hate me. She really cares about me. She just has another priority right now. That's a good way to reframe it. Another thing that helps with assumption journaling is gratitudes. That always helps the brain reframe into what is true, what is important, what you can control, and what is in front of you. And I love this quote that I continue to keep hearing, is that, and it's, you can't be grateful and anxious at the same time. So gratitudes are definitely helpful for anxiety and any fears that you have. Okay, so we talked about the happiness killers.